Top of the morning to you. Welcome to our special coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Olumide Macaulay. The headlines. Russian drone attack injures one, torches warehouse in Lviv. Russia calls on world courts to throw out Ukraine genocide challenge. Plus, Poland proposes ban on Russian diamonds and LPG in new sanctions package. Many thanks for being with us this morning. Russia launched a drone attack on the western Ukrainian city of Lviv early this morning, injuring one person. A 26-year-old man has been hospitalized after he was pulled out of the rubble with an open fracture of a limb. Local officials say the roof of an industrial warehouse in one of Lviv's districts is on fire as a result of the attack. Emergency services are working at the scene. The Moscow-installed governor of the Russian-held part of Ukraine's Donetsk region, Denis Pushilin, has confirmed the blast of the local government headquarters, but says that no one was killed or wounded. The blast occurred on Monday, and earlier Russia's state news agency, the RIA, reported that a series of blasts had been heard at the headquarters of the Russian-installed local authorities in the city of Donetsk in eastern Ukraine. The city's Russian-installed mayor said in a statement on Telegram that central Donetsk had come under fire. Russia is calling on the UN's highest court in The Hague to throw out what it calls a hopelessly flawed case, challenging Moscow's argument that its invasion of Ukraine was carried out to prevent genocide. The Russian request was made at the start of hearings dealing with the jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice, also known as the World Court. Moscow says Ukraine was using the case as a roundabout way to get a ruling on the overall legality of Russia's military action. Experts say a ruling in Kyiv's favor will not stop the war, but could impact future reparation payments. Ukraine brought the case days after the Russian invasion on February the 24th last year, arguing that Russia is abusing international law by saying the invasion was justified to prevent an alleged genocide in eastern Ukraine.
Is not accusing Russia of committing genocide. Ukraine is also not accusing Russia of failing to prevent or punish genocide. On the contrary, Ukraine insists no genocide has occurred. That alone should be enough to reject the case, because according to the court's jurisprudence, if there was no genocide, there cannot be a violation of the Genocide Convention. Ukraine's legal position is hopelessly flawed and at odds with the long-standing jurisprudence of this court.
Ukraine submits that Russia has violated Articles 1 and 4 of the Genocide Convention. But it is evident to all, and simply undeniable, that this case is not about whether Russia has failed to prevent or punish genocide, contrary to its obligations under the Convention. What this case is really about is the legality of the special military operation and the recognition of the DPR and LPR as states.
European Union High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy Josep Borrell has laid out the EU member states' priorities for the 78th United Nations General Assembly. Mr. Borrell says the EU wants to implement sustainable development goals to get the 2030 agenda on track and pointed out the need to tackle climate crisis as well as support Ukraine.
Sustainable development goals. We have a vital opportunity to get the 2030 agenda on track. Our offer and key contributions to accelerate the deliveries of the Sustainable Development Goals is the Global Gateway, and our 300 billion of investment supporting the Sustainable Development Goals implementation. The second issue is climate and environment. Certainly, we must foster our joint commitments ahead of the COP28. And for this, for us, the full implementation of the Paris Agreement will remain at the forefront of our actions. Needless to say, after what has been witnessing this summer, the world is no longer heating, the world is boiling. And so many meteorological incidents shows that the climate urgency is a reality more than a prospect. The world is becoming more and more multipolar and less multilateral. It's a paradox because it is the way it is. Our multilateral system has to be more inclusive and effective, and we are committed to play a leading role in supporting the United Nations Secretary General Common Agenda. We insisted on the idea that we need African solutions for African problems, and we stand ready to support further the African Union and ECOWAS. We want to continue working with Ukraine to ensure a broad support for its peace formula from as many United Nations members as possible. And for that, all the ministers will continue its intense reach out with partners. And about the absence of Xi and Putin, well, we have to continue working. We cannot sit and wait for them to come. We have urgency. The war costs everyday lives. And the sooner it finishes, the much better for the ones that could save their life. For Ukrainians first, for the Russian soldiers also, and for the rest of the world which is badly affected by this war. So we will continue our work for a just peace with or without the ones that could maybe contribute to that.
Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky met with wounded Ukrainian soldiers at a New York City hospital on Monday ahead of his address to world leaders at the United Nations. In his first in-person visit to the 193-member world body since Russia's February 2022 invasion, President Zelensky is due to speak to the annual General Assembly of world leaders today. Mr. Zelensky traveled straight from the airport after landing in New York on Monday to Staten Island University Hospital, where Ukrainian soldiers have been treated for amputations. His next stop is Washington, where he is expected to meet the U.S. President Joe Biden and members of Congress. In a post in Telegram, Mr. Zelensky said he plans to meet military and business officials.
I'm Mike Dowling. I'm the President and CEO of Northwell Health. And for those that don't know, Staten Island University Hospital is one of our largest facilities. And I want to begin by complimenting everybody here at the hospital for everything that you're doing to help with the situation in Ukraine as much as we possibly can, because it's a big healthcare issue, it's a humanitarian issue. And what President Zelensky is doing, obviously, is protecting democracy and protecting the way of life for the rest of us. So it's unbelievably important. And so we're delighted to be doing this, the little piece that we can do. We've sent lots of supplies to the Ukraine, and we will continue to do that. We have lots of ambulances going to the Ukraine beginning next week. We have a telemedicine program that connects with the hospitals and the doctors and the nurses in the Ukraine. We're going to be working on mental health issues in the Ukraine. President Zelensky's wife is very, very involved, obviously, along with a lot of other people on mental health. So it's our privilege to be able to help any way we possibly can. We will continue it. What you're doing, Mr. President, is absolutely extraordinary. What happens in Ukraine is important to all of us. This is not an issue just for over there. This is an issue that protects us here. And as you said on television last night, that this is a protection of democracy and of the Western way of life. And so we thank you, Mr. President, for everything that you're doing, and of course all of the people here.
For us, very important that all our words, all our messages will be heard by our partners. And if in the United Nations still, it's a pity, but still there is the place for Russian terrorists, it's the question not to me. I think it's a question to all the members of the United Nations.
President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, after previous attempts at a sit-down had fallen through, President Zelensky and Brazil's President, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, will at last meet on Wednesday in New York City. Mr. Lula, who's faced accusations in the West of being soft on Russia over its invasion of Ukraine, will meet with President Zelensky after a bilateral meeting with President Biden, on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly. This will be President Zelensky's first in-person meeting with a Brazilian leader. Poland has proposed that new EU sanctions against Russia should include a ban on Russian diamonds and liquefied petroleum gas, and called for aligning sanctions against Belarus with those against Moscow. Sales of diamonds brought $4.5 billion to Russia in 2021, and Poland is proposing putting individual sanctions on the Russian Alrosa Diamond Company, which, according to a local paper, has supported Russian military forces and the Russian war efforts in Ukraine, both directly and indirectly, for many years. Poland has also urged the EU to halt purchase of Russian LPG. Joining us now is publisher, Business Ukraine magazine Lviv Today, and editor at the Odessa Review, Mr. Peter Dickinson, who speaks to us virtually from Kyiv in Ukraine. You're welcome to the program. Good morning.
Good morning.
Concerning this case at The Hague, the UN highest court over the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, for which reason they say is because of genocidal intentions of the Ukrainian government to wipe out the Russian ethnic minorities in Ukraine. Is there a case to be argued for Russia? Were Russian minorities or Russian sympathizers victimized in eastern Ukraine?
Well, according to Russia's own statistics, so one would assume they are favorable to Russia's case, the number of people who were killed in East Ukraine, in the conflict area, in the year before the invasion, was in the low double digits. I believe it was around 12 or 15, something in that region. So that sort of level of fatality, while of course every death is a tragedy, that level of fatality is a long way from talk of genocide. It suggests what it was, a low-level conflict that was going on for some time with firing across the lines from both sides. So there's very little evidence to actually support Russia's claims. Russia has consistently, since the war began in 2014, made similar claims that Russia's minority, the so-called ethnic minority of Russians in Ukraine, are under threat. This is actually a traditional trope of the Kremlin. Just the other day, we had the anniversary of the Soviet Union's invasion of Poland together with Nazi Germany. And it was noted that in 1939, Russia invaded Poland to, quote, unquote, protect oppressed minorities in Poland. So this is an excuse that Russia has consistently used for decades to justify acts of international aggression, and they've provided no real evidence to support the idea that Russian-speaking Ukrainians or ethnic Ukrainians are in any way oppressed.
These 12 people you mentioned, were they unjustly killed because they were Russian sympathizers or pro-Russian?
No, they were killed or they died as collateral damage, unfortunately, as civilian victims in a war that was ongoing. Nobody, to the best of my knowledge, has been singled out and murdered due to their identity. The entire notion of Russian-speaking Ukrainians as a separate and specific category of citizens is very problematic in itself. Most Ukrainians are bilingual. they speak Russian and Ukrainian. They may have a preference. They will speak one or the other predominantly, but they will have a fluency in both languages. And the use of language in Ukraine is no indication of political affiliation. There is no such thing as it is completely inaccurate, rather, to suggest that a Russian-speaking Ukrainian is a politically distinct category of Ukrainian that has that you can attach any sort of opinions to, particularly the idea that they may be pro-Russian or pro-Putin or pro-Kremlin simply because they speak Russian, essentially in most cases, as an accident of birth. Because Russia dominated Ukraine for so many decades, the Russian language has always, in the modern era, dominated. So a great many Ukrainians would probably fall under the category Russian-speaking, who have absolutely no sympathy for Russia's political stance.
Who then, help us understand, Mr. Dickinson, are the pro-Russian, Russian-speaking Ukrainians that were allegedly targeted by Ukraine?
Well, this is a category which is essentially a fantasy, a figment of the Russian imagination. They are in the same category as the so-called Ukrainian Nazis who are doing the oppression. They don't exist. There is no evidence of people being attacked and victimized, never mind being killed or in other way physically harmed, because of their so-called pro-Russian stance. There are a very limited number of high-profile figures who were killed during the 8 years of the low-level war, so to speak, from 2014 to 2022, who were Russian sympathizers. But their deaths, I would say, are not associated, could not be tied to some form of a state oppression of a category or ethnic group. They were specific attacks on individuals who were regarded as collaborators, who were regarded as enemies, essentially, who were working for Russia. And the numbers here, we're talking about a few very high-profile cases of people from the political sector and from the journalistic sector. So the idea that Russian-speaking Ukrainians or ethnic Russian Ukrainians as a class, as a segment of society were oppressed is not supported by the evidence on the ground, and Russia has already failed to demonstrate that in the international legal bodies. I imagine they will do again in this case.
Okay, sorry, I don't want to flog a dead horse if that's the case, but who then were the separatist people in Luhansk, I believe, and other areas that prior to the war, this war in Ukraine, were agitating to be a part of Russia or were pro-Russian? Were they Ukrainians or were they Russians who infiltrated Ukraine, or were they Ukrainian Russians who were more pro-Russian than pro-Ukrainian?
Well, the regions that came under Russian control from 2014, this is the Donetsk and the Lugansk regions in eastern Ukraine, alongside the Crimean Peninsula. These regions had traditionally been areas which had supported political parties that were pro-Russian or pro-Kremlin. However, they never demonstrated any majority sentiment in support of actually joining Russia. There's a big difference between supporting a political party that sympathizes with Russia or that favors ties with Russia and actually calling for your country to join Russia, for your country to essentially cease to exist. There was never any sign of that in a majority sense. Support in polls, and this was questioned. This was surveyed and researched many times before the war broke out in 2014. And support in these areas, certainly in East Ukraine, was very low traditionally. It was in the low double digits, in the teen digits, perhaps even early 20s. It was never anywhere near majority level. So when the war broke out in 2014, all of the leaders, all of the prominent figures who rose to positions of authority in these areas of East Ukraine that became so-called People's Republics, they were all Russian citizens. The entire operation from day one was a Russian Kremlin-controlled operation, and the people in charge in East Ukraine were all Russian citizens, almost without exception. So it was very obvious and very clear that this was, in fact, a Kremlin act of aggression and not a local protest or uprising.
Do you think, Mr. Dickinson, that Russia will be held accountable by The Hague, and because of the arguments against the jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice, that maybe the long arm of the law concerning Russia will be too short?
I think it's very unlikely that we will see senior Russians, including Vladimir Putin first and foremost, in the dock, in court, in The Hague, facing justice. I think that is an unlikely scenario. It can't be entirely ruled out, but I think it does. In order for that to happen, Russia essentially would have to collapse as a government, as a state. Now, that also could happen potentially. There is more and more active discussion of Russia's instability, especially after the Wagner mutiny, highlighted how reluctant the Russian establishment is to actually support Putin. But I still feel that it's unlikely. I think what is more likely is that Russia's leadership, again including Putin, will be tried, will be found guilty of crimes against humanity, potentially will be found guilty of genocide, and will have penalties imposed on them, which will include financial penalties, which will include restrictions on their activities, and will also confirm Putin's long-term isolation. But the idea of him appearing in court and then going to prison seems very, very far-fetched, and I don't think even a successor government, in fairness, would be likely to agree to that, because it would seriously damage their credibility in the face of the Russian people, who would be extremely opposed to any such ideas of putting Putin in prison.
All eyes are on the United Nations General Assembly in New York this week and tomorrow for a Zelensky appearance. What do you expect will be an outcome, or what do you hope will be a realistic outcome of this assembly pertaining Ukraine?
Well, what would be the outcome? Well, we have to be realistic here. This is the UN. The UN has proven itself to be ineffective. Let's be polite here. It's proven itself to be fairly toothless in this war. It has not been able to actually shape events, or certainly it's not been able to stop Russia's invasion. That much is clear. There was an interview just in the recent days of the Secretary General essentially admitting, speaking with CNN, I believe, and he said quite openly, I have no power. I cannot enforce the will of the UN. I cannot force Russia to end its invasion. So the UN, I think we need to be realistic about what the UN can and cannot do. But what it can do is send a clear message of global opinion, and it has done that on a number of occasions with regard to Russia's invasion. So I think Zelensky's main objective will be to consolidate that opinion, to underline that the world stands with Ukraine, and to underline why it should continue to stand with Ukraine. They highlight the issues that are involved here, the fact that the invasion of one country by another and the annexation of land is a threat to all countries' territorial integrity, because it sets a precedent that could be repeated by other nations, by Russia itself and by other nations. So he'll be looking, I think, to underline these sort of fundamental issues that are at stake in Ukraine, and to gain, to consolidate the support that Ukraine has seen in previous UN votes. But realistically, I don't expect anything major to come out of this in terms of policy or in terms of impact. And I don't think Zelensky does either, but he's no fool. He understands what the UN can and cannot do.
Finally, Mr. Dickinson, we're going to be reporting on Ukraine filing a lawsuit against Poland, Slovakia, and Hungary over the food export because they've decided to extend the ban on the import of Ukrainian agricultural product. Isn't this like biting the hand that feeds you? Why would they go as far as to go the route of a lawsuit, knowing that Poland is one of their greatest allies? Not Hungary, we know, is in the middle, Slovakia, but Poland especially.
Yes, it's a very challenging situation, and it's a very, I would say, controversial move by Ukraine. I would assume that it is a negotiating tactic at this stage, that they are looking to respond without necessarily wishing to go through with this threat or this lawsuit itself. The situation for Ukraine is quite serious. The land route to the EU for its agricultural produce is an economic lifeline. So the restrictions imposed by Hungary, Slovakia, Poland are very dangerous for Ukraine. They must have this grain route, this agricultural route open because of the blockade of their ports. In a peacetime environment, Ukraine would send the vast bulk of its agricultural exports to global markets from the ports in the south of the country on the Black Sea coast. That's not possible now because Russia has blockaded those ports. Some produce is still leaving via sea, but it's limited. So the land routes are essential. Blocking them is a major economic issue for Ukraine at a time when it has no room for maneuver economically. So they are desperate, clearly. But I would imagine that they will not pursue the legal channels with full vigor, because that, as you mentioned, that would be biting the hand that feeds them. Especially Poland has been an absolutely crucial partner, and it would be very damaging for Ukraine to undermine that relationship.
Indeed. Thank you so much, therefore, for your insight today and your contribution this morning. It's much appreciated. Mr. Peter Dickinson, publisher, Ukraine magazine Lviv Today, editor at the Odessa Review, who joined us from out of Lviv.
Thank you.
Welcome to the sophomore stretch of today's coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. The northern coast, NATO drills in the Baltic Sea have been injected with a note of grim realism in light of Russia's war in Ukraine. The drills kicked off on September the 9th and involved some 30 ships and over 3,000 personnel from all NATO countries in the Baltic region, plus soon-to-be members Sweden and non-Baltic allies, the US, Canada, the Netherlands, Belgium, and France. German Rear Admiral and Exercise Director Stefan Heisch and Chief of Latvian Navy Captain Maris Polens say the Russian presence in the Baltic Sea, including an intelligence-collecting vessel frigate and an aircraft, was normal and expected, but this year's NATO exercises have moved away from artificial scenarios towards reality.
Is that, for example, one Russian intelligence collecting vessel has been present here all of the time, which is normal. As I said, we recognized some aircraft that had overflown our forces. We recognized some Russian frigates showing presence here in the area. So, but as I said, everything normal and everything as we expected. For many years, we had a kind of artificial scenario, and right now we are a bit more close to the realistic, meaning the geography and the partners and the opponent. So it's more realistic than it was before.
For Latvian Navy, now it's important to look after development of future capabilities. We're looking at development of coastal defense capability. We have started to do that. And of course, we are looking at the Black Sea region where mining, demining, that becomes a reality. So we all the time we have been working on historical ordnance disposal. Now it's coming to the real mines, and we see that this is actual threat. Also can become also in Baltic Sea if some similar conflict appears in this region. So we need to be prepared.
Bulgarian farmers brought out their tractors to protest on Monday after the country's parliament voted to scrap the ban on import of certain Ukrainian products. Grain producer Kostadin Alexandrov said farmers were struggling to compete on price with imported agricultural goods, even though food prices in Bulgaria's shops were high. The resolution passed by Bulgaria's parliament said the ban had been ended, taking into consideration the country's solidarity with Ukraine, and the competitiveness of Bulgarian agricultural producers will not be affected. Restrictions imposed by the European Union in May allowed Poland, Bulgaria, Hungary, Romania, and Slovakia to ban domestic sales of Ukrainian wheat, maize, rapeseed, and sunflower seed, while permitting transit of such cargoes for export elsewhere. The restrictions designed to ease excess supply expired on Friday, but Poland, Hungary, and Slovakia have imposed their own unilateral bans. Meanwhile, Ukraine has filed complaints with the World Trade Organization, WTO, against Poland, Slovakia, and Hungary over those unilateral bans on food imports from Ukraine. Ukraine's Ministry of Economy says it sees such restrictions as a violation of the EU countries' international obligations. The three countries announced their own restrictions on Ukrainian grain imports on Friday after the European Commission decided to not extend its ban on imports into Ukraine's 5 EU Eastern European member states. Still on grain bans, Spain's Agriculture Minister Luis Planas Puchades feels a unilateral ban by any EU member state on Ukrainian grain imports smacks of illegality, and says it's up to the European Commission to judge. Planas Puchades' German and French counterparts also said they thought the unilateral bans were not in line with EU law, and they are waiting for the EU to respond. German Agriculture Minister Cem Özdemir and Poland, Slovakia, and Hungary says of them that they were practicing part-time solidarity that risked playing into Russian President Vladimir Putin's hands in the conflict with Ukraine. However, Austrian Agriculture Minister Norbert Tutschnig avoided criticizing the unilateral ban, saying that his country expects the Commission to make the EU internal market work well, and saying more needs to be done to export Ukrainian grain to the countries where it's needed. Warsaw, Bratislava, and Budapest say they are acting in the interests of their own economies and that their moves are intended to protect their own farmers from a glut of product.
The fact that any member country, I'm not judging one member country, but any member country takes unilateral action restricting what is the access to the single market seems to me something that is out of the law, but is to the Commission to judge. So is why we will have a council beginning at 10 a.m. And during this afternoon discussion, we will listen from the Commission, and I wait as presidency the explanation of what has been achieved on Friday and what is the follow-up that the Commission will take about the decision. I understand 3 member states, for the moment being, that have announced unilateral restrictions on that.
We now bring in former lecturer on diplomatic and consular relations law, Nasarawa State University, KEFI, Mr. Chukwemeka Eze, who joins us from our Abuja studios in Abuja, North Central Nigeria. Welcome to the program this morning.
Thank you, Lumide.
Mr. Eze, where does the sovereignty of nations who are part of international bodies start, and the influence of those bodies in their internal relations stop? Because the European Commission, to which Hungary and Poland and Slovakia obviously have loyalty to, are saying something different to what their own sovereignty will dictate, the interests of their own farmers. Who is dropping the ball? European Commission or these countries who have also said they are staunch allies of Ukraine?
Yes, these countries have conceded part of their sovereignty to the European Union by signing the treaty establishing the European Union, or accessing or ratifying it. they had conceded a percentage of their sovereignty. And that treaty does not allow unilateral actions. So you are aware that by Article 26 of the Vienna Convention on Law of Treaties, there is a maxim we call pacta sunt servanda. That is, agreements are meant to be kept. Having signed those agreements, they are meant to keep it. And they are not allowed to use their internal issues as excuse for shirking their obligations under the treaty they have conceded to. So it is not that the concession of sovereignty has been imposed on them. They voluntarily signed treaty, the European Union Treaty, binding them to it. So it is not for them to begin to complain now because they actually signed that treaty and it is binding on them. And recall that they operate by consensus. EU operates by consensus. So unilateral actions are not allowed, and if something drastic is not done about it, on other issues, countries that are not comfortable with it, we just say, okay, we are taking unilateral action. Now, you remember Brexit. Because Britain or United Kingdom didn't want to be taking unilateral actions against their commitment to the European Union, they exited the body, the organization. So you cannot be in and out. If you want to remain as members, you are bound by all the provisions of the treaty you have signed. So I think the European Union is not interfering with their sovereignty. Rather, they consider part of their sovereignty, and they cannot turn around and approbate and reprobate. So they either approbate or reprobate, but they cannot do the two at the same time.
Very good, Barrister Eze. Now, this raises a dilemma, or a quandary, if you will. If these nations who are representing their citizens at the highest level of government are seen to be going against the livelihood of these same citizens because they are signatories to the EU, where does that leave their support to their citizens who democratically elected them to governments? First case. And then second case in point, the Ukrainians, who are fast friends of the Polish, and the Polish who have committed not just support militarily, but in as much as they can in other ways, their efforts against Russia. Why would you want to take Poland to court?
Yes, the first case, which has made them to actually go against, act unilaterally. Remember that in May, it is the same EU that allowed 5 countries to conduct that ban. So why shouldn't they rely on the same EU for further ban? So they have no excuse to go unilaterally. I know politically what they have said or what they have done makes sense, but there are other ways to go about it. They could go back to Brussels, negotiate their way for the 3 countries to be allowed. So it is, if 5 countries were allowed in May to carry out that ban, it means that the 3 countries could also be allowed, and they can tell their people that we are negotiating with Brussels. After all, they have benefits they get by being obedient or complying or loyal to Brussels. That's where, in Belgium, the headquarters of the EU. So if this one doesn't favor them, they ought to make their citizens to understand. That's one. Number 2, there are some other measures. For instance, they should tell their people that Ukraine is at war. And they need to, since they are friendly to Ukraine, they need to take measures, including allowing their wheat to come in, or perhaps agree with Ukraine by way of bilateral agreement to reduce or even increase the prices or reduce their supplies so that the shocks that they will feel in these 3 countries will be lesser. But to take unilateral actions, because that's where the problem lies, it is the unilateral actions they have taken. And Perhaps they have gauged their political temperature to discover in the course of time, it was, we viewed that farmers in Bulgaria are already protesting, even though they are not part of this, but their parliament has taken off the ban, and they are protesting. So these three countries, their farmers are at unease, and they don't, the actions taken by their government, I think they are supporting it, but they need to, there is a balancing act. So they cannot, by solving one problem, create another. That is for that. As for the World Trade Organization, where Ukraine has sued Slovakia, Hungary, and Poland, I think in those countries, I mean, by international relations, they don't see it as a hostile act. I mean, by suing somebody, they might not have an agricultural agreement with Ukraine, and if they don't, they will not be breaching any treaty bilaterally, but multilaterally. All of them are members of the WTO, and they are bound by the rules of the WTO. So they are supposed to, if there should be any ban, they ought to have gone to the WTO. If they don't want to go to the European Union, I think Ukraine is right by going there because they don't want to engage in self-help. And the courts or the tribunal at the WTO at The Hague is competent. It's for this purpose that it was established that countries that are taking measures that will interfere with international economic cooperation, I mean, can be sued in that place. It's not death sentence. They can continue with what they are doing. But whether it directly affects their support for Ukraine for the war, that's another issue, because for Poland's support, it is in Poland's interest to continue to support Ukraine, because the enemy to my friend is my enemy. You recall that Poland is still being threatened by Russia. So Poland will not gain anything by supporting Ukraine. It will not gain anything by going against Ukraine in favor of Russia. So it is in its own permanent interest. If you go by the history of Poland, it is in its own permanent interest to continue to support Ukraine militarily, but that does not mean that they cannot disagree in international trade or agriculturally. So you mustn't agree 100% on all issues. So that's the way I see it. They have disagreed on this, and they will be meeting there. And militarily, I think the support will continue, except for Hungary, who is standing in the middle in terms of this support, because it cannot, Orbán, the current president of Hungary, cannot, by his body language and even his interviews, has shown that he cannot be hard on Russia. So I think on the second leg of your question, it is a mixed bag. Militarily, they can continue to support Ukraine, but concerning their farmers and the things that put food on their table, they can disagree. They can agree to disagree.
Well, it's not a good look. It's not. I don't think it's been perceived that Poland will withdraw their support for Ukraine, but this disagreement in such a public way is something that maybe could tantamount to washing your dirty linen in public. Just before we let you go, very quickly, can you tell us what your expectations are of the United Nations General Assembly as Ukraine makes a presentation tomorrow?
Yes, I think that will be a talk shop, although Ukraine knows that nothing much will come out of it. But they are expecting a statement that will indict Russia. With the G77 plus China non-aligned movement that just ended in Cuba. You see the body language, the communique released shows that many countries, they are fed up with sanctions and other economic measures, although they call it, to them, that these things will affect the role of science, technology, and innovation. But it became clear that they were addressing the Western world. So I don't know how the votes will go. Previously, we have had situations where Most countries were in support of Ukraine, but there had been a lot of movements in the BRICS, in G20, in G77 plus China, and there have been contests of loyalty between Russia and the United States. So, but the United Nations General Assembly, the vote is by simple majority. So they can vote. If they vote and have a strong state, if they succeed in having a strong statement against Russia, it will just be a moral booster for Ukraine. It will not in any way affect the boots on the ground, because by virtue of Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter, it is the United Nations Security Council that has to safeguard international law, order, and security. And as they are divided, China and Russia on one side, and United States, Britain, and France on the other side, there cannot be compromise on issues concerning Russia, Ukraine, and the obvious implication is that the world order and law will continue to be in tatters, and no enforcement can take place. So there can only be a talk shop. They will talk and decide on the statement. How strong it will be, I don't know, because of the factors I have spoken about. But we look forward to receiving a statement from the General Assembly, which might be a compromise or either have strong words for Russia concerning this war.
Yes, the whole world is watching. And we thank you, Barrister Chukwuemeka Eze, for your insight and contribution this morning, who joined us from our Abuja studios, former lecturer of Diplomatic and Consular Relations Law, Nasarawa State University, KEFI. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Olumide. Thank you so much.
And now we turn our attention to the world of business and how it's affected by the war in Ukraine. Ini John Mekwa joins us. Ini, good morning.
Good morning.
Russia's oil revenue is set to surge.
Yeah.
Why? Pray tell, because we thought that was in decline.
Exactly. So oil sales, which we discussed yesterday, has dropped about 40–45% since the beginning of the year. That's what they are selling out. But guess what? The price of oil has been surging in recent months. And they also have a hand in it. So like this morning, Brent is about almost 95. It's been like that since yesterday, 94.84. That's $94.84. Yeah. And WTI, which is normally really low right there, is also 92. And both of them have crossed the $90 level. That's really high. So what it means is they don't need to sell as much, to make as much revenue. So that's what is bringing this. And I mean, I must also say it's also good for us here in Nigeria, because our production, we've not been able to hit our last production, I think for August, was about 1.18 million, when we're supposed to do about 1.8 or 1.6 at least, according to the forecast of our budget. But our oil revenue has also increased because prices are now really high. And at the bottom of that is Saudi Arabia and Russia. They have cut, their oil production for some months now, and they've said that it's going to. Yes, okay. They did on purpose, just to get this down, the hike in price, which is paying them, and they've said they're going to sustain it. I think both of them have the cut of about 1.3 million barrels every month. So obviously that has tightened the market, and that has been determining price for some months now. And I don't know if that affects, because what happens is at the end of the day, demand adjusts to what you have in supply, and so it doesn't affect price that much, after the effect has waned off a bit. I don't know if that will be sustained till the end of the year, but they have said that their cut is going to be sustained up to the end of the year. In fact, there's some quarters still talking about them extending it up till next year, 2024. But we'll see. But I mean, that's what they're making the oil-producing countries enjoy. But on the other hand, oil marketers are finding it difficult, because what has happened is, with the surge, the hike in oil prices, there's also a hike in processing, in movement, in shipping. Those prices, the way it is, there's an announcement that salaries are going to be increased. Then the woman at the market also wants to get a share of it, so she also increases her price. So there's also been an increase in the price of capital capital that is required to move this oil, to work around the oil, to process the oil. So marketers are also paying for it, for this increase. But I mean, it's on the paper. It's good for countries like Russia. It's good for countries like Saudi Arabia. It's good for countries like Nigeria.
One of the last times Russia and Afghanistan were mentioned in the same sentence was the debacle of the military presence in Afghanistan many years ago. But now Russia and Afghanistan in the same sentence again?
Yes. So they are trying to mend fences now. And remember that thing of your friend, the friend of my friend, or the enemy of my enemy is my enemy. You know, of course, Afghanistan has been under sanctions from the West for a whole lot.
We're talking about the Taliban. The Taliban, who have zero
human rights, yes.
Especially after the withdrawal of the Americans.
Well, desperate times is calling for desperate measures. Russia is looking for new routes to trade. They're looking for new customers. And they seem to be finding comfort with Afghanistan. Obviously, I mean, from 2021, trade ties between both countries had been dropping. But I mean, at this time, they seem to be finding comfort in Afghanistan and, overlooking some of those compromise, some of those very, of course, disturbing, which is a human rights issue, which the Taliban and Afghanistan are known for. But it seems Russia wants to overlook all of that and in a desperate move. I mean, yesterday we talked about their economy. We talked about their inflation, how they've had to hike their interest rate 3 times in 2 months. You know, so they're honestly looking for where to dispose or sell some of their natural resources that have been developed, which they have been banking on.
So are they looking to export to Afghanistan?
Yeah, both sides trading with each other. That's what they're actually looking at.
I have to say that this particular Taliban administration, post the American withdrawal of their troops and their bases in Afghanistan, seem to have taken a softer stance. They're not making as much noise as they used to make.
They're not, but they're being harsh, especially to the women.
No, they're very harsh as far as the human rights record is concerned, because it's very vague and murky. We don't even know what's going on in Afghanistan. But there have been efforts, I think, on this side of the administration of the Taliban now, who are in many ways nameless, to mend fences and to be seen with countries, to be seen to be a more open,
receptive
Taliban administration.
I mean, because no country can actually survive on its own. I don't think that's possible. There's no country like that. Not even the great United States, can stay on its own. They have to trade and interact with other countries. So I guess they've seen that. Well, I'm hoping that their attempt will also be will also lead to them being a bit soft on the human rights. I mean, what they're doing to the women there, stopping them from going to school, from driving, expressing their rights, is so frustrating, right there. But I mean, maybe their interaction with other countries, I don't know if Russia can influence them. Since we are still asking Russia to stop the war, I don't know if there'll be a good influence or even a worse than what we have there,
Many thanks, Ini.
Thank you for having me.
And that's where we leave it for today's edition of Russian Invasion of Ukraine. I'm Olumide Macaulay. Thanks for watching and have a good day.